Hello and welcome to the Frontline special issue on education. My name is Vishal. I'm doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge in sociology. And today we have a very distinguished guest, Professor Surinder Jodhka. Professor Jodhka is a distinguished Indian sociologist and a leading authority on social inequalities, caste, and rural transformation in contemporary India. He serves as a professor of sociology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University in Delhi, where he has also chaired the Center for the Study of Social System within the School of the Social Sciences. He's particularly known for his work on caste in contemporary India, analyzing how caste continues to shape social and economic life in both rural and urban contexts. Professor Jodhka has an extensive publication record, having authored over 20 books and published more than 100 papers and book chapters. Most notably and most recently, his book, The Indian Village Rural Lives in the 21st Century, published by Aleph, the Oxford Handbook of Caste, which he co-edited with Jules Naudet, and Caste in Contemporary India, amongst many, many other distinguished publications. Professor Jodhka, it's an absolute pleasure to have you over here, and thank you for taking the time.
Thank you very much, Vishal. Thank you for having me.
Right. I thought we'll start with some very interesting issues that you pointed out in some of your previous work. One thing that really stood out to me was this one quote which you've said in a paper where you said precisely at a time when all sociological evidence points to caste decline, it's becoming increasingly visible and complex. So what are the paradoxes of caste you see in India's neoliberal economic landscape today?
I think it is an interesting way to start the discussion. I mean, everything changes, and caste is not something that is kind of a strange thing. I think we should think of caste as a reality. And when we think of caste as a reality, we also recognize that caste is about hierarchy and inequality. Caste is about exclusion and denial and discrimination. So we had a kind of structure in place, which obviously has not been static ever. It was also internally undergoing change, and there are various ways in which caste is practiced in different regions of the subcontinent, beyond India as well, across religious groups. The caste is not something which is new. Caste is not something which is invented by the British. Caste has been around for a long time. The word caste obviously is a Western word, but that doesn't mean that the reality of caste was absent there. But I think the paradox becomes very clear, very evident to us after India, in some sense, becomes a nation state. And I think becoming nation state is a very, very critical moment, more than I think the significance of British colonization is the fact that India has now become a nation state. And when we talk about India becoming a nation state, it's a democratic nation state. It's a constitutional democracy. So I think everything has to be seen in relation to the constitution. And this democratization that begins to happen after India becomes independent, to some extent it begins before that. There is enumeration process, obviously, reframes identities and communities through numbers and stuff like that, on which lots of people have written, and that is relevant here. But more importantly, I think after India becomes a democracy, there is a process where everyone, in some sense, begins to aspire for what one would call as citizenship. And I think citizenship becomes a kind of formal normative, that this is how India ought to be as a country, where every individual, not even a family or a household, every individual, think of a society which was structured around communities and caste groups, where every individual has the right to vote and right to seek justice as an individual. And I think that was a kind of major turning point. That's why constitution becomes very, very critical. And this Republican, in some sense, political framing obviously helps everyone to reimagine herself or himself, and communities to reimagine themselves. So it is in this context that initially, obviously, caste was not mobilized, but as democracy progresses, along with democracy, I think state-initiated programs for development were very critical. Likewise, state-initiated policies, which are kind of policies of affirmative action, we call them reservation in India, and various other kind of policies which enable people to, in some sense, aspire mobilities, aspire to move towards the notion of citizenship. And it is in this context that when people encounter caste as a barrier to their aspiration of becoming citizen, and I think that's when this paradox begins to manifest itself. So if you look at Indian democratic history, first 20, 30 years, there is discussion about caste. For example, Rudolph's, when they talk about modernity of India's tradition, or there are other writings on caste coming into democracy. That is not appearing as paradoxical. People think that it's a kind of nice way to think about India, where caste groups can also take the form of civil society kind of associational groupings, and if they are coming into democracy, it is well and good. I mean, what is wrong with that? But that doesn't really become an issue, because these are communities which are already dominant. They don't really have a crisis of citizenship. In their local context, they are also dominant. So if you look at the history of caste becoming a kind of visible reality, and becoming much more at some level beginning to feel very oppressive, it's the post 1990s. And 90 is a very important point, when there is a kind of resurgence of Ambedkar after his centenary birth anniversary, as well as introduction of Mandal Commission. Also, India is kind of beginning to develop and urbanize and industrialize much more after economic liberalization. So I think there is a kind of overall revolution of aspirations, and that is the contradiction. So when people are talking about caste post 90s, they're not talking about caste as a traditional structure which we should kind of be aware of, which we should be conscious of, which we should not lose, but it is in the language of citizenship. And when it begins to be articulated in the language of citizenship by those who have been on the extreme margins of historically of Indian society, this includes obviously the scheduled castes, but also sections of OBCs who were not very different from scheduled castes, and they begin to look at data, look at numbers, look at in some sense absence of their representation at every level. They might have representation in the political system, but when it comes to bureaucratic structures or judiciary or otherwise economy that is growing, they find it hard to, in some sense, uh, uh, enter in that arena. And that's when they begin to scream that, for us, caste is still relevant. I mean, how can you say caste is not significant? Caste is what oppresses us. Caste is what is source of our denial, and we experience discrimination, and we are absent, but, our numbers are this many. So I think that is the paradox I think I talk about.
Very interesting. I think that actually leads me right on to my next question, where, I mean, you said post 91, which obviously heralded this era of economic liberalization. Um, I understand it as, once that happened, caste hierarchy started mutating and changing its form as well. So could you elaborate on how you think caste operates in India's contemporary market economy and the effects it has on hierarchy and inequality?
Yeah. So there are two different ways of thinking about it. Many people, for example, the mainstream uh, middle class of India, what we call as the Nehruvian states, who wanted to modernize India. And this is something which is supported by a large volume of sociological theories, which we call as modernization theory, or general theories of social change, or in economics, you have this whole literature and development studies. So all of them looked at caste merely as a traditional structure of hierarchy, and a traditional structure of hierarchy was supposed to melt away with the process of modernization. So if you look at writings of even somebody like Jawaharlal Nehru, or early social scientists, or theories of modernization, so the only thing they think ought to be done is to industrialize and urbanize India. So because caste was visualized as a traditional structure of hierarchy, and traditional structure of hierarchy was only a kind of mental hangover. And since it was a mental hangover, it was again attributed to certain kind of spatial locations. That if you're living in the village, your life is governed by caste. Once we move to the city, caste would automatically go away, because you don't even know who your neighbor is. You don't know who you're working with. You don't know who has cook the food that you're eating in a restaurant. You don't know where the water is coming from. So these are things which become irrelevant, and therefore caste will automatically disappear. So you don't need to do anything in terms of state policy. You can be indifferent to it, and the best way is to say, for example, on question of whether caste should be counted or not. So it's better to not talk about caste. The best way to get rid of caste is to not talk about. There was insistence from Ambedkar and some other sections for quotas, so the quotas were given to scheduled caste, but then general categories were called as general. The very idea of general means that they are above caste, so they don't really have a caste, so they are caste free in some sense. So that is one way of looking at. So where caste was seen as something which would automatically disappear, you don't really need to do anything. It is at some level exceptionally Indian, but even if you were to compare, it is similar to things that existed in other part of the world before they became modern, before they became nation states, and before citizenship was introduced or constitutional democracies. And in those societies, those structures have disappeared. In India also, this will go away. Now, this is what I describe in my work as an imperative of disappearance, that caste has to disappear. Caste is, and that is how even now middle class tends to imagine caste. Caste is not something that should be, in some sense, in discussion when Vishal and I'm talking about, because we are just individuals, we are self-made, we have educational qualification, we can talk to each other. Our occupations are decided by our education, our personal pursuit. So where is caste? Why should we talk about caste? So I think this was a very, in some sense, simple and simplistic way of looking at it, but it also suited lots of people. They didn't want to talk about the stickiness and ugliness of caste. That caste was also a structure which was very deeply embedded in what I call as the material realities of society. Say, for example, lots of people actually wrote about even rural India, that how caste was a kind of slavery. And slavery means there are power relationships. This is not simply about ritual hierarchies. This is not simply about tradition. This is not simply about mental hangover. The local structures of agrarian economy, for example, or local structures of non-agrarian economy, the way occupations were distributed and the way they were valued, they were all embedded in the notion of caste, and that's how caste became a source of denial and deprivation. Likewise, even when you come to the city, if it is a structure of discrimination, if it is a structure of inequality, which implies materialities, your ability to, educate yourself, your ability to. I mean, there's a plenty of literature which actually comes out from Europe, from societies which had already become modern. They begin to talk about inequalities in a very different language. That inequality is not simply moving from tradition to modern, moving from collective to individual, moving from rural to urban. It is also something which is at some level much more structural, because, say, for example, Pierre Bourdieu, when he talks about cultural capital or social capital, so these are embodiments, that we embody certain privileges, certain identities, certain resources, the way we are able to speak to each other in English language. Neither of us comes from an English-speaking culture, but we are able to communicate with each other. It's not so easy for people who have grown in those marginal ghettos, even if they have always lived in urban areas, so their education level will be different. So is there a kind of overlap between the emergent structures of inequality and pre-existing structures of inequality? And that's where the reality of caste becomes, in some sense, the second perspective. My perspective would assign materiality to caste. That caste is not something that you can just wait to go away. It is a reality that will need to be confronted. That will need to be confronted politically, through policy, and otherwise also morally. So I think that's why, in some sense, hierarchy then becomes a problem, right? When we are talking about caste, we are not simply talking about a dance tradition that Indians have had, and this is how we used to eat our food. It becomes a problem in the sense that it denies people certain resources, but it's also a problem for society. I mean, you ignore a large section of population, You don't really allow them to unfold their potentials. So I think in that context, the second framework is what I subscribe to, and I think that is empirically much more interesting and much more real.
Like you mentioned, caste also has a major role in affecting people's life chances and where they can be in society and how they can be mobile socially and economically. There's one strand of research and work that's coming across that saying that caste is not playing so much of a role in society today. It's class that is affecting people's life chances. And there's some scholars who also say that for particular privileged sections of society, they identify themselves as casteless. How do you look at this development, and what do you make of this notion of castelessness, or when people say, I don't believe in caste?
I think this is again a kind of misnomer, the way knowledges about society have evolved globally, the way theories of society have been coined, and the manner in which they are in some sense translated. Because we think of caste as a tradition, and we think of India having been a traditional society, and now it is becoming modern. Likewise, for example, in the textbooks of sociology and anthropology, we have this notion of closed system of stratification and open system of stratification. We think of Western industrial societies as societies which are based on class. And the moment we think about class, then theories would also say that you acquire class status through individual kind of endowment, your education. Everyone has equality of opportunity, and the outcomes depend on individuals' efforts, and that's how inequalities of class come into being. But that's no longer believed by social scientists. That's not the case, right? So this was a kind of mythology which was created by modernity itself, by the way in which capitalism produces systems of legitimacy for itself, which in some sense is founded on inequality. But these structures of inequality, again, somebody like Karl Marx, who had conceptualized that capitalism destroys all the pre-existing structures of hierarchy and inequality, he was not absolutely right. I mean, obviously, it transforms them, it changes them, but at the same time, there is a significant continuity, right? So again, now there are writings recently done by sociologists. If you look at surnames, and this is not a study of India, these studies are comparative studies mostly of Europe. If you look at the surnames of elite, and they've seen significant continuity over the last 500 years, wherever you can find those names. So it doesn't happen accidentally, right? So when capitalism develops, the certain categories of people who have earlier been privileged are able to kind of continue to live in privilege. There are structural changes. There are some other people who come into being. Society undergoes change. Not that changes don't happen, and those changes are happening in India as well. But at the same time, unless you identify those as problems of citizenship, of inequality, of denial, you would not be able to overcome them. And if you were to compare, say, for example, a country like Sweden with a country like Germany, and this is something that scholars have been doing now in Europe, the structure of inequality are very different. The manner in which race functions in the United States, it's very much like caste, right? And this is tolerated, even though there are kind of celebrations of America as being an open society. But those structures of those realities of race are not simply questions of color difference. They are embedded in the economy. They are embedded in society. So it's not like we have to think of India as an exceptional reality or caste as an exceptional phenomenon. But yes, it has its own specificities, and we need to engage with those specificities at the local level. So this myth about class as being open and modern societies being open is also a myth. And this obviously is produced and reproduced because it legitimizes a certain kind of structure of inequality.
Absolutely. Yeah, so I think schools play a major role over here. For schools, one of the major promises of it in a democratic society is that somehow they will provide equality of opportunity. And then in India, we have this phenomena of private schools as well, where recent some reports suggest that more than 50% of India's children go to private schools, which of course is a very heterogeneous classification. There are schools that charge 1,000 to 5,000 rupees a year, and schools that charge 20 lakhs a year as well. But broadly, what do you make of this phenomena of this increase in private schools and the effect it has on caste in India today?
I think this is very, very important, and this is where we need to kind of uh, create more sound, right? I think people are not talking about the way inequalities are reproduced. So, on the face of it, we have open education. I mean, anybody can go anywhere. And as you said, actual reality is eventually comes to how much money do you have. And I think it's not simply money, it's more than money, right? The very idea of liberal modern constitutional society is that it would ensure equality of opportunity. And the starting point for equality of opportunity is that every child will go to the same school. And some of the Western societies have actually, or they had institutionalized this system quite effectively. Even, say, for example, we kind of denounce America as a very cruel capitalist society. But the fact is that they have a culture of sponsoring education, and they spend a lot of money on primary education. At least early education, school education is accessible to everyone. Neighborhood school is not only available to everyone, but it's also quite resourceful. Right? It's not a bad school, generally speaking, or they were not. Now things are changing in America as well. So I think even then there would be problems, but otherwise in a country like India, that was initially perhaps attempted, but we, in some sense, found education to be a very useful way of reproducing those cultures of inequality, as I would call that. So we are very comfortable with inequality, and particularly those who are in positions of privilege. They figured it out that in order to keep our privilege intact, we need to make sure that our children don't interact with each other, right? So I think this initially there were these because we also have this history of English language, which again is needs a separate kind of treatment, but it's very closely tied to the making of Indian middle class elite during the colonial period, and that middle class elite becoming, in some sense, the establishment of post colonial India. And this establishment is not only in the state system, it is also in various other valued sections, valued sectors of economy and social and cultural life. So I think they were more or less entirely from a particular kind of social milieu, which was generally upper caste, historically urban or landed. And I think that is the class which, in some sense, began to make sure that schools were differentiated. Lots of us, generation after independence, they studied in government schools because there were not too many private schools. And even if they were private schools, except for the missionary schools, they were not very different. They were run by the reformist kind of movements like Arya Samaj in North India or Sanatan Samaj and stuff like that. There were lots of these schools in Punjab. We had Akali Singh Sabha schools, and in South India also likewise you had these community reformist schools. So initially they were not very different from the government schools, but gradually this kind of difference began to increase. I think sometime again in the late 80s and early 90s, when the democratic aspiration begins to expand. So at that time, Dalits, for example, they were virtually insignificant in schools. The moment they started coming into schools, their aspirations increased. Then school began to acquire a kind of mixed character, and that's when the urban middle class, even in urban areas, for example, if you look at history of university campuses or IIT campuses, all of the central universities and IITs, all of them have Kendriya Vidyalayas, central schools. And these central schools used to function very well, almost until the 1990s. I've seen it personally in University of Hyderabad and here in JNE. And then gradually this differentiation begins to happen. And the post 90s private schools begin to grow. And the main thing that private school is emphasizing is that we will teach them in English language. But again, as you said, private itself is not really good enough. There are lots of private schools which are just charging a little bit of fees, and there is some English education, but it doesn't really go very far. And as scholars have pointed out, when private schools begin to come in, the Sarkari schools, the government school also begins to become a kind of school for the deprived sections, right? So when poorer come to those government schools, even if they are functioning well, teachers begin to lose interest in teaching, even though they are reasonably well paid. And this kind of increases a kind of hiatus between the student and the teacher. Teacher comes from a kind of relatively privileged background. She or he thinks that these people don't need any education. The family is not able to help them in doing homework, so they are not in that sense great achievers. So I think education historically everywhere becomes the site of reproduction, not only of inequalities of class, but those class inequalities are very closely tied to other structures of inequality that we have in India. It could be caste is obviously one of those, but also rural and urban becomes very significant. Even in villages, I've seen in my own studies in Punjab and Haryana, the well-to-do families in villages of Punjab and Haryana would send their children to urban schools, and the Sarkari school or government school becomes a kind of, in Punjab it used to be called as Harijan school or Dalit school for the poor. So I think that is something which obviously requires intervention if we want to have become a kind of democratic republic, a constitutional democracy. It cannot happen only through elections and votings. It will have to be also, in that sense, done at the level of education and various other, what Amartya Sen would call as basic entitlements. How do you provide healthcare to your citizens, housing, and various other things? And India has the capacity to do that. It's not like India cannot do it.
So how would you classify or theorize this development that more than 120 to 150 million children go to private schools today? So would you classify that as a aspiration for mobility or dignity? That's something that private schools can only provide? Or you think parents are voting with their feet and saying government schools do not have the quality that they aspire for? How do you look at this?
Yeah, that's the only thing that parents can do. I mean, if parents aspire for their children, I remember I was doing field work in Madhubani district of Bihar, and this village, otherwise, these are very deprived regions. 75% of the workforce is working outside the village. Young men, particularly, they migrate and they work outside. And but parents work very hard, and then they would want their children to go to an English medium private school. And there would be some private school nearby, but there are no teachers there. There are some teachers who are teaching there. So I think the privilege of the urban continues, right? So, for example, we saw recent, and this is something that has been unfolding itself for the last 2 decades, where agrarian dominant castes who were earlier very privileged and they saw themselves as privileged are asking for inclusion in OBC category. Why are they doing that? So their children are educated, and many of them are educated in private schools. But when they come to the city and they have to compete for a valued position in corporate sector, it's very, very difficult because, again, my own studies show that when you go for interview in a corporate economy, in a company which has very high status and salary, the first thing they look for is what we call as soft skills, and those soft skills are acquired through family upbringing, and so it in some sense privileges the already privileged. So this obviously, as we were discussing earlier, so they then see caste as a variable which kind of keeps them behind, and they are in some sense, in comparison to urban upper castes or historical privileged communities, they see themselves as going downwards. And so you have all these things happening, and that obviously is connected with the way education in some sense limits a large number of people, even if they are educated. Everyone is more or less every child goes to school. It's not like people are not educated. Earlier we used to talk about illiteracy, right? Illiteracy is not really a problem for people who are, say, below the age of 14 or 15. They would all be illiterate, more or less, right? 95%, 90%, wherever you go, all across caste groups. But at the same time, how far do you go with that elementary education?
Let me just slightly shift tracks a little bit to the higher education sector. And one of the things that I think classifies the higher ed sector in India is affirmative action, one of the very deeply contested notion. Yeah, I think it was brought in to address historical caste-based inequalities and to some extent class-based inequalities as well. What do you think has been some of the main challenges and consequences that have emerged in its implementation since independence?
Yeah, I think we should not try to simplify things. We should not try to see that, like in some sense, I was also suggesting that caste is mechanically reproducing itself through education, which is true and not true. Empirically, if you go to any IIT or IIM today, things have changed. In last 50 years, seats that are earlier IITs did not reserve seats for scheduled castes, right? Uh, because there were very few candidates available. Now you have reservation not only for scheduled castes but also OBCs, right? And these seats are in great demand. And that's why these new communities want to come into OBC status so that they can compete for those OBC positions. Even Indian Institute of Management, people, the seats that are reserved for scheduled castes and OBCs, they get filled. So education has been the kind of space of churning. That's why even Ambedkarites would say, educate, agitate. These are very important processes. So education has been, in a sense, some kind of equalizer. Education is still available to everyone, and this education is a secular education at some level. It's not caste education. It's not something that you do in a kind of one-to-one relationship that guru chela parampara. So at some level, education is a valuable entry point in the world of privilege and resources and source of mobility. That's why there is so much aspiration for education. There's so much investment in education, and lots of people have been successful. And I think it's connected to India's policy of affirmative action. And I think if we did not have reservations, we would not have had a Dalit middle class which is trying to articulate questions of citizenship, right? And I think that has played a very critical role. And this is where I think in last 20 years, particularly earlier, higher education was more or less public funded. Most of the top universities were public universities, IITs, IIMs, they're all public funded. But there again, now with this post-liberalized elite becoming very self-aware, there is a kind of internal differentiation happening within the higher education space. IITs and IIMs are still very valued institutions, and reservation has been extended there. But if you look at the public universities, they are kind of being undermined. And there is a problem of funding, but also otherwise you have the emergence of a new generation of private universities, which obviously charge very high fees, and they are not obliged to have reservations. So I think higher education is changing a lot, but it is no longer a kind of exclusive site of privilege for the historically privileged communities. So I think there is a kind of growing diversity. That's why you have suicides in IITs, right? Suicide happen because these young kids are poor kids, are they trying to integrate in the system, and then there's a pushback, and it is in that moment that they feel completely marginalized. But it's also a sign of changing times. And I think one should look at the complexity of it rather than try to simply kind of conclude it one way or the other.
Absolutely, I completely agree. I think since the Mandal Commission, this report was implemented full-fledged, I think there's been significant criticism of the affirmative action scheme in India, particularly from the upper castes, who often invoke meritocracy as an argument against reservations or affirmative action. So how do you respond to this based on your research on merit and discrimination, and how meritocracy and capitalism, how do they coexist together?
Yeah, I mean, exactly in the way then in which you are suggesting. I mean, meritocracy itself is in some sense a way of thinking about things, right? it's a kind of ideological system. So you think that merit is something which is embedded in one person, then his or her ability to work hard and being more intelligent, having more IQ. And now we have plenty of literature which would suggest that this is the fact that we call it meritocracy, democracy, or it's a kind of ideological system where an impression is created that that person who comes from general category, she has come on a seat which was open and had competed for it, and the person who comes in a quota category is necessarily not meritocratic, which is empirically not the case, because there also, if there are 5 seats in reserved category in a class, there would at least be 500 kids competing for that. And now there is also this, if an SC candidate is competent enough to be placed at top, even in general category, she would be kept in the SC category, so that that position can be kept open for the general category. So I think the situation is much more complex, but obviously it works as a system where the privileged castes or privileged groups put the burden of all the ills in society on reservations, right? And if the reservation was not there, they would not have unemployment. If the reservation was not there, all the doctors will be competent. If the reservation was not there, we would not have corruption in society. And I think this is a kind of system which is propagated to legitimize some kind of caste hierarchy, some kind of status quo.
So I have one final question for you, and this is a rather long one. In that, higher education, I think, for a really long time has been asked to carry the burden of perhaps the failures of school education. And higher education has, in popular discourse, become one of the main sites of contestations on identity, particularly. And, like, these are young minds where a lot of notions are created at an early age. So, do you think it is possible for higher education to address the problems and the shortcomings of school education? How do you see these two systems working together to perhaps solve larger questions of identity, inequality, and hierarchy?
That's a very interesting questions. I think one should also kind of unfold the underlying, in some sense, complexities of it. Why school education is not a contested space? I think I've not really seen anyone working on it. My own immediate guess would be that school education is so differentiated, so well differentiated, that there is no contestation. For example, if you go to a municipality school in my neighborhood, children who come there, they are more or less of homogeneous background. Likewise, if you go in a private school where, as you were saying, the fee could be 20 lakhs annually, or even 40 lakhs annually. There are schools like that here in Delhi or in all metropolitan cities. Again, you would find homogeneous kind of, in terms of social background, people who come there. They also have similar kind of way of thinking about how the society should be, and all of them will be English medium schools. All of them would have all kinds of global curricula. Now you also have these international schools, and so they also have their own ways of distinguishing themselves, but also they're very exclusive. And this exclusivity obviously does not create tension within the school, right? And higher education, despite all these kind of problems that we were talking about earlier, still continues to be a much more differentiated space. A person who is from a kind of historically disadvantaged category, like we were talking about IITs or IIMs, or even some of the private universities, they do want to have some kind of symbolic presence of people coming from disadvantaged categories. And when they come there, they obviously are grown up enough to raise these questions, and they are also stigmatized that you have come under special category, therefore you're not good enough. And they obviously feel that pain, and they also then become political, and there is kind of contestation of those exclusive privileges, and then higher education becomes site of contestations with it. Second point, I think, would be that it is the entry point to job market, right? School is not an entry point to the job market. And I think it's in the higher education that recruitments happen, campus placements happen. And I think that's also the site where, and historically, political movements have been, in some sense, articulated in the university campuses. And I think university campuses do become very, very significant. And I think which is a good thing. I think that's why we talk more about caste today than we did earlier. And these are the sites where articulations happens, and there are all kinds of people like us also who may not come from a disadvantaged category, but find these as disturbing structures, and then they begin to do research on that, or they begin to kind of articulate those questions, because the dominant or the normative, moral normative of contemporary times is the normative of equality, right? We all want to be equal. We all want to be human beings who are able to connect with each other, and that is something which at some level disturbs, or it should disturb everyone, and if it is absent. So I think it's a positive thing that there is contestation in higher education, and that contestation can produce certain kind of creative solutions, and that's where we need to invest, and I think India is doing that. It's not like the way, for example, when I was a student, the way we used to talk about caste was very different from the way we talk about caste, or the way you talk about caste is again 5 steps further ahead. And there are many things that you will take for granted, and then you would say that, yeah, how can you legitimize caste when you're getting married? But the fact is that many people do that. How would you raise the question of caste when you're being recruited? But the fact is that companies do have that kind of culture where these kind of, then it gets framed as discrimination. The moment it is framed as discrimination, then it is at some level a different kind of reality, which morally becomes unacceptable, and also legally it should become much more a problem and unacceptable. And there should be some kind of way of confronting it institutionally, not simply as a kind of moral or political question, but also something which violates the foundational values of our country, or our culture, or humanity. And it's also not simply a matter of just a nation state. As we know now, caste has become global in higher education. When children go to study in Cambridge or in California, there also question of caste has become an issue. Now there are these kind of associations of students coming from Dalit background in London colleges, or in Western universities, or perhaps also in Cambridge. So I think these are interesting moments. I think it's quite a kind of important point to talk about.
I think a major takeaway that I've had is I think caste is a lot more complex than we assume it to be. And as you say, it's not perhaps in anybody's best interest to simplify it into simple notions, and to actually question and critique the complexities of how it's emerging. And also that I think education is a major site for these contestations. And we need to be talking about these, how school education and higher education is playing a major role.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Right. That, that's about it. And thank you so much for your time, Professor. I think this was a very engaging conversation. I think this is perhaps these conversations need to exist a lot more in the public discourse, and I hope this place.
That began to. Thank you so much. Thank you for running.